So shall I get going with the presentation then?
Yep.
So yeah, this is a presentation on vining and packaging. Let me just share my screen. Now I will so first of all this I actually did the most of this presentation previously back in 2016 in person at UBrew, which is the fining bit. So I kind of reprised the slides here, quickly refresh them. I hope I've refreshed them correctly. If not, then apologies. And then added on a few at the end about packaging. I guess we'll just kind of see where we get to it, whether we run out of time or we can always save the sort of packaging for another evening, but it's obviously can be quite a broad subject. So yeah, we'll just sort of see how I go with it. So anyway, yeah. So back in thinking about this a long time ago, back in 2010, I went to I think it might have been like the craft beer company or something like that bar, and was given an American IPA, something I'd never had before. And although it was from a very good London microbrewery, and I looked at it, and it was kind of clear as mud. And I remarked upon that, and the person that was with me said, "Well, you don't drink with your eyes." And I think that's kind of fair enough. It didn't detract from the beer's flavour as such, and it certainly taught me not to judge a beer initially by its looks. But I do think that having a sparklingly clear beer does add to the experience. I mean, if you went to a famous restaurant and everything you got served was just sort of this brown sludge, no matter how amazing it tastes, you'd still be slightly disappointed. I mean, maybe that's a theme for a future restaurant, who knows? But you'd probably still be disappointed because the presentation just isn't there. So I think that it's definitely a case that you eat with your eyes, and I do think you do actually drink with your eyes. So making your beer look as appealing as possible, I think is actually an important thing. And I think we're seeing it. People come back to it now from having gone through. Initially, I remember the days of London Murky, where you get sort of these American IPAs with or pale ales, which had a bit of crystal in them, so sort of a almost browny color, but also very, very hazy to the point of being opaque. It wasn't the most appealing of drinks, and now it's sort of some of them are going back towards sort of being nice and have a nice clear appearance. If not sparkling clear, then at least sort of visibly sort of see through it clear with a very light haze. So um, why should you fine? You can make perfectly clear beer without adding anything to the beer. And sometimes that so sometimes the fact that you've got a beer that is not clear is just a symptom of problems in the brewing process that are going to show up, and they might then cause other flaws in the beer as well. So I'll talk around that as well, but in a little bit. And yes, as I said, not all beer needs to be clear, but I think if it's not going to be clear, it should be hazy, not opaque. I did once go to a newly opened micro pub in Crystal Palace. They served me a beer on gravity, and it came out looking like an actual milkshake, and was told it's unfined. And I was like, yeah, that's just yeast in there. Um, Unfortunately, despite saying all of this, that appearance matters. Obviously, BJCP only give you 3 points out of 50 for appearance, and only really one of them is for clarity, generally. So, I mean, you can have a beer that tastes in every way amazing, and you'll score very well, despite the fact it doesn't look like much. But I do think that actually presentation does factor into the score when you're judging. The moment you pour that beer out, if it gushes, you're like, if it's murky, if it comes out beautifully, sparklingly clear, then you're like, oh, okay, this is good. And as I said, quite often the way that the beer looks can point to other flaws in the brewing process. In commercial terms, though, one of the reasons why commercial breweries will fine is actually for shelf stability. I'll get a bit onto the why what haze is, but basically removing the excess proteins in a beer that can help with shelf stability because it can cause a beer to stale more rapidly. Same with sort of removal of yeast. But ultimately they only really do that for beer for where it's a brewery that has little control over what happens to their beer once it leaves the brewery. So is it going to sit on a shelf in a warm store for 6 months or more? Um, and finally as well, like fining can actually accelerate the conditioning of your beer. And I mean that by it coming to its sort of peak in terms of flavors. Once you remove the sort of excess proteins and yeast and things like that, and your beer gets clearer, you'll find actually the flavors become more defined, sharper, and generally just less murky, really, is the only way I could describe it. You'll find that sort of IPAs, when you could end up with a yeasty bite that detracts from the hop flavor, and then once you've managed to remove all of that, you get a nice cleaner hop flavor through. Yeah. And obviously as well, the other thing I've got to show on the screen there is gushing as well. Particularly when you bottle condition, if you get too much in the way of yeast and trub into the bottle, that acts particularly when the beer is warm as nucleation sites for the carbon dioxide. And the moment that you then pop that beer open, carbon dioxide sticks to that, and that's when you get a gusher. So all of these things will basically have benefits of fining. So what are the causes of haze? Generally, the most common is that the reason you get haze in beer is because of a combination of protein, which comes from the malt, and polyphenols or tannins, as they're also known, which generally come from hops, although also can come from the malt. You get a lot more protein from wheat and oats than you do from barley or other adjuncts that derive from them. You will get those, as I said, the polyphenols can come from grain husks, but also from hops. So, for example, when you add a lot of hops, you'll get an increase in haziness. And the reason that your hazy IPAs, which I don't think existed when I first did this presentation 8 years ago, or at least they were very sort of fledgling. So when the hazy IPAs, the reason they are generally actually hazy is because of heavy dry hopping, which adds a ton of polyphenols, and that causes the beer or causes the haze to form. The other form of haze you can get is chill haze. Same cause, proteins and polyphenols, but slightly different in that they are low weight polyphenols. So they're very, very, they're very, very lightweight, and basically they only come into being when the beer's chilled down. It induces or it basically increases the strength of charge on the polyphenols, which then causes them to precipitate. Again, when the beer warms up, that charge weakens and falls apart, and you then no longer have a hazy beer. I've seen this in the past when, for example, you get cask beer served from a keg cellar. You'll know because you'll get like a pint of Pride or whatever else, your landlord or whatever else you want to drink, and it on a very cold pint glass, but then also comes out looking a bit like the beer on the right hand side of this picture here. But if you leave it to sit for 5 or 10 minutes, you'll actually find it just goes back clear again as that chill haze disappears. So yeah, I'll comment on a little bit on how you can resolve those. So it's temporary, although if you leave chill haze long enough, it can become a permanent feature. So yeah. Last one is the other major cause of haze is yeast. So yeah, given time, that will settle out, but initially when the beer is very young, you can have a lot of yeast in suspension. and that's more in the case of where you've got beers where you want a bit of flavour from the yeast, like a wit beer or a Hefeweizen, where those yeasts are very, very dusty. They don't stick together and flocculate easily, but they do lend a flavour, so they've been selected out for that particular flavour. Having said that, there is a difference in flocculation between different kinds of yeasts. The ones like the sort of USF5, Chico kind of yeast that American ale are quite dusty, and do not flocculate quite as easily as some other yeasts. You get some like the British ale yeast tend to stick together and drop like an absolute rock very quickly, whereas the American ale yeast will maybe attenuate a bit better, but as a result don't drop out very easily. So yeah. Few other causes of haze you can get are generally less common. I'd be looking for the other ones first of all. So you've got one of them is where the wort is deficient in calcium. By that I mean less than about 30 parts per million of calcium. Part of that is that you end up with a beer with the wrong pH. In particular, we know about in the mash, if you have a too high a pH, then not only do you not convert all the starches, starch carried over could also then cause a haze, but also then you can extract excess tannins from the malt and from the malt husks in particular. And again, talked about tannins, polyphenols do contribute, or one of the main causes of haze. The other reason to have a reasonable amount of calcium is for precipitation of calcium oxalate, which is a reaction between the oxalic acid in barley and the calcium. If you don't have enough calcium in there, it doesn't stick together and won't precipitate out. That can also then end up causing beer stone in your fermenter as well. Similar reason. Other things I mentioned about oats and wheat and things like that, but also under modified malts can carry a lot of other causes of haze. Again, if you don't convert properly, you leave any starch in your beer, that can end up leaving a haze. I've seen particular issues where you do like brew in a bag. If you don't have a fine enough bag and you don't tend to always recirculate, then you can end up with a whole load of flour in the boil, and that can end up causing a little bit of a problem. Other things, infection. I think recently we've had there's been a few people making hot sauce and things like that after Steve's presentation, where you're doing a lacto ferment. And one of the things you notice with that is it starts off when you put everything in with your sort of salt brine, it starts off reasonably clear, and then it gradually glows cloudy. And then that cloudiness kind of settles out to the bottom. That cloudiness is lactobacillus bacteria. Yeah, basically you can, if you have a severe enough infection in your beer, then you can actually end up with a haze causing about that. But obviously, generally, you should know about it from the taste, if it's an infection, or maybe it was intentional and that's the way you want it to taste. But that is something that is very difficult to remove without filtering. Similar sort of thing you can have if the yeast gets particularly stressed. It can release various either if it's in sort of a high strength beer, high extract concentrate beer or high temperature, yeast can release something, I think it's glycogen, which can also cause a similar haze to unconverted starches. And then finally we've got other things like if you just other foreign matter in your beer. So if you've got a new steel fermenter or something like that, and you've not cleaned it properly, you can end up with a whole load of oil and other stuff in there. That can end up being not very nice. You'll generally see that from a nice sort of grey metallic crud sitting on the top of your krausen and on the top of your beer at the end. Might also end up tasting metallic. And then the other thing was like if you actually overdo the finings, I've got a picture of that somewhere further down. But yeah, if you massively overdo your findings, you can end up with what I've heard described as like fluffy bottoms. But basically, you can end up with sort of this almost like jelly substance sitting in your fermenter. Looks really weird. So when you see the dosage rates on a finding, pay attention to it. More is not better. More can be worse in this case. So start off at the recommended amount. If it doesn't work, maybe increase it a bit. But yeah, otherwise pay attention to the dosage rates. It is important. Yeah.
James, I was just going to mention something about overstressed
Yeah, go ahead.
yeast. I've noticed that with pressure fermenting, I think. So the first generation of the yeast is fine, and it drops out and it's nice and clear in the normal time, like 2 or 3 months. But if I put a wort on top of yeast that's been under pressure, like second generation or third generation, it takes about a year to clear. No, Joe, it really just won't ever clear. And I don't know why. I've never really been able to work out why that is, but I haven't been over pitching. It's just I sense that it's, as you say, it's damaged somehow, but I don't know why. But I noticed it quite a lot, like on several occasions, that it just won't clear.
How much were you pitching it onto, like a whole yeast cake, or?
Um, I try and do like 250 ml of slurry, so not the whole thing, maybe half or something. But that's possible as well. That there's all kinds of other crap in there as well, but also a little bit of an overpitch maybe. I
So
do suspect that there are all lots of dead, broken yeast cells in there. That
if you
Yeah, I mean,
pressure ferment, if you pressure ferment, then you don't have the cell growth in the beginning. So you're probably pitching the same cell count than you did in the first pitch, except the yeast has gone through a fermentation. Yeah. Okay, off topic.
no, but
not
that's
at all. If it's affecting if it's affecting clarity, then I don't think it's a off topic. I mean, it's one of those things. If that's what's causing it, then yeah, beware. I've not seen it myself, but I do know said if you have a bad fermentation, apart from two things can happen. One is infection, and the other the stress on the yeast can release. I said I think it's glycogen, but I need to go and check that. That causes causes a haze on its own. So
I wonder if it's that. Yeah, thanks.
cool.
Another one to mention is oxidized beer. If it's highly oxidized, you can just look at it. It's got this sort of browny, hazy color, and yeah.
It's love it when I get a grey IPA.
Yeah.
That sort of greyish purple tinge. You're like, ah, yeah, I know that. Okay, move on. Let's see. Right, findings. On to the main subject, really. So I'm going to separate this into two types of findings. The sort of copper stroke kettle findings, so before fermentation, and then I set up there post fermentation, but really I guess these can be during and post fermentation findings. And I would always say I'm going to give a few options for both, but I would always pick one for each. Don't mix them. Don't use like 3 in the kettle and then 3 more in the fermenter, because one, I mentioned about dosage, and two, they work in slightly different ways, and one can counteract the other, and then it just doesn't work. So in also many ways, you sometimes you just need to try it really. But as I said, try one, stick to the dosage rate. If it doesn't work, maybe try it again with a bit more dosing. We'll also cover, somebody mentioned it on Slack as well, about particular use of Browsol and issues with it. I think I might have cracked it. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So yes, kettle findings generally go in towards the end of the boil, 5-10 minutes from the end. And what they all do is they will cause proteins in the wort to coagulate. They cause them to coagulate, so the beer goes from, or the wort goes from looking reasonably clear to a sort of I can describe it sort of, I've heard it described as egg drop soup, but kind of like if you poach an egg and you do it badly and you get a little bit of sort of egg white floating around all over, it looks a little bit like that, just a bit more broken up. Yeah, just these chunks of protein floating around in it. That will generally accelerate it. Equally though, to be honest, a good boil, a good rolling boil will generally cause that to coagulate on its own. And quite often you don't actually need to add any finings. Yeah, if you get a good boil and you're seeing all that stuff coagulating, don't feel the need to add any. But you might want to add some later on in the fermenter. The post-ferm or the fermentation finings, usually historically you'd add them before bottling. I've got a few on here as well now, which you can add pre-fermentation. Generally, though, these will work to remove yeast, potentially chill haze and things like that as well. But they also, the big thing about them is they again, I mentioned earlier on, they accelerate conditioning. So it's kind of like liquefied time. So let's see, copper finings. Yeah, last 5-10 minutes. The main types are the ones which are carrageenan based, which is a type of seaweed, historic or previously known as Irish moss, or now the tabletized forms are Protafloc or Werfloc tablets. You could probably also get it in powdered form as well. The correct dosage for those, I'm not sure about Irish moss, but at least for Protafloc, is half a tablet for your 5-gallon batch. Again, you don't need to throw in a whole tablet. I do have a picture of what happens if you overdo it. More is not better. So actually, if you're going to do anything, a quarter of a tablet will probably be preferable. Yeah, that's that one. Again, just chuck it in 5-10 minutes before the end of the boil. Super easy. One I've used more recently, quite a bit, is Polyclarb Brew Bright, or it might just be called Brew Bright, which is it's a white powder that's a combination of carrageenan and I'm not going to give it the full name, but just PVPP, which is a kind of a basically just a plastic, I think, which is a polyvinyl pyridone or something like that, which has been used commercially quite a lot because it's vegan friendly, amongst other issues, but also works quite effectively to speed up conditioning on in the fermenter as well. Yeah, Brew Bright I've used quite a bit. Actually found it very effective at getting beer very clear if I just use it on its own. Bit of testing to figure out the dosage of it, but again, follow what the instructions say, and you can't go too far wrong. Yeah, so the only issue with that stuff is, or anything that contains PVPP, including Brew Bright, is you are supposed to make sure that you don't put it into your keg or bottle or anything like that. So commercially, they would centrifuge to remove it before going into package. We don't tend to have. I've not seen a homebrew centrifuge on the market yet. Maybe it can be filtered out. I'm not sure. But again, I've used it. Generally, I just means that I'm careful about what I rack out of both the kettle and the fermenter. And as it is, my stuff is also in kegs anyway, so all of the hazy stuff tends to get sucked up and left at the bottom of the keg, depending on how I'm dispensing it. But yeah, that stuff's very effective. The other one, which can be used in either kettle or fermenter, is Browsol. So you can either dose that again a few minutes before the end of the boil, or even in the whirlpool, I think, while still hot. And apparently, I've not done this, but if you put it in whilst it's still hot, you'll see the wort actually goes white very briefly and then changes back. Yeah, not quite sure how that works. I've used Browsol more on the post fermentation side. Has anyone used Browsol in the kettle at all? No, okay. Yeah, it's there on the fact sheet about it. So it's again obviously something you can use. One thing I am trying with it now, though, is I think Ken has mentioned before, he puts it straight into the fermenter before filling it. I'm trying that at the moment, although it's with an IPA, it's going to be quite heavily hot. So
Put it
don't know if
in
it'll
the
make a big difference.
whirlpool
Right.
when it's cooled down a bit, about 50 degrees.
So Browsol is a solution of silica acid, I think, silica gel, basically, and yes, it's you use a very small amount for sort of 7 ml or so for a five gallon batch. So the difficulty is in getting it mixed in properly, but it does seem to be very effective. Very, very effective, in fact.
James,
And,
is your Browsol quite? So I get mine from Malt Miller, and I'd say it's like a thick. It's not even thick. It's still liquid. It's not. I'd say it's more liquid than sort of a viscous thing. Is
Yep.
yours kind of more viscous than that then?
no, I wouldn't say at all.
Okay.
I think the biggest difficulty, I'll come on to talking about it. I'll talk about it now. The biggest difficulty I found with it, I think, is in getting it mixed in fully. And this goes for most of these findings that you might use on the fermenter side. When you put something into the kettle, because of the boiling motion, it tends to get mixed in very easily. Whereas when you put anything into the fermenter, if it's a very small amount of liquid, like say 7 milliliters into 23 liters, that can just drop straight through and not actually get mixed in with the rest of the beer. So I found actually that that's the biggest trick. And one thing I think Rob mentioned using Browsol was to stick it in the line before you transfer the beer from the was it from the kettle to fermenter, or from the fermenter to your keg?
Yeah, so kind of both. So when it comes out of if you're transferring from the fermenter, but also sometimes I go from keg to keg as well. So like, yeah, when I'm purging the CO2 out of it, I make sure the CO2 comes out the line. So there's no oxygen in the line either. And then just sneakily try and squirt a little bit in there. And then as it transfers, it should mix.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I found this. I tried adding it a couple of times, and I sort of got partway through filling a keg, and then go, oh, forgot it, and then added it in, and it worked okay. But then most recently, I put the dosage of 9 ml of it into the keg before filling it, and like 3 weeks later, the beer is like this. In fact, it was about 2 weeks later, it looked like this. It is like literally read a newspaper through it. So it is very effective. The problem just appears to be getting it mixed in properly. And that's not surprising with such a small volume. I mean, maybe you could dilute it first with a bit of water and then mix it in. But I have seen the same issue with gelatin as well. Whereas if you sort of tip it into the top of a fermenter and don't get it mixed in, again, it doesn't work as well. Mix it in properly, and it's like magic.
First few times I used it, and I used a party tap to kind of get the beer out. I was quite excited because the first 50 ml was ultra clear after a few days. But because I hadn't mixed it in, I suspected that the Browsol had all sunk to the bottom, because the next beer that came out was all cloudy as normal. Which was really annoying. So now I've taken to kind of swishing the keg a lot, and then rolling it on the floor, all the usual ways of mixing it in. But I didn't realize you could use it in the boil. That's a good idea, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much it will carry across into the fermenter then, because coming back to what I was saying earlier on, when you dry hop your beer, you're then adding a whole load more polyphenols to the mix and causing a haze again. So although you spent a whole load of effort getting rid of it, you kind of just reintroduced everything again. So that's kind of where you might want to have a heavier dose of findings at the end of fermentation, at the end of dry hopping, if you're worried about it. So the other options you've got here, so I went through a few options. So traditional R1, ice and glass. made from the dried swim bladder of a sturgeon, I think. Possibly other fish are available. I'm not sure. They're not vegan for obvious reasons. And whilst they are very traditional, I'm told that they are not as easy as other findings to make up, and once made up, do not store as well. So unlike my pouch of Browsol that is just sat on the shelf and says "do not refrigerate" on it, the isinglass, you kind of have to mix it up and then use it. So
I've tried mixing isinglass. You're stirring for hours and it doesn't mix in. I don't use it, don't like it.
yeah, I've heard of people like they need to use like the sort of stick blenders and things like that. And yeah, it's like, but they are incredibly effective when used. Particularly, there is a auxiliary findings. So there's additional findings you can then use. That's kind of a 1-2 punch. I think they have opposite charges, so you use one and then the other, and between the two of them, they take everything out. But yeah, just not great for a homebrew occasional brewer. When there are better options out there, if you're not bothered about them, particularly if you're not bothered about it being vegan. And the big one for me is gelatin. If you're not worried about your beer being vegetarian or vegan, then gelatin is incredibly powerful, very effective, very cheap. You can buy it in any supermarket. Not too difficult to make up. I will go through the instructions for that on the next slide. But yeah, you can have a beer that goes from fairly hazy to absolutely read the Bible through it, sparklingly clear in 3 days. Again, you do need to get it mixed in properly though. It also will, like isinglass, it will pull down chill haze. So even in very cold beers, it will take that out. It helps if you get the beer cold first of all before adding it in, because obviously it can't precipitate out something that's not there. So yeah, the gelatin is like powdered thyme, really speeds things up. So if you've got, say, like a lager you're going to put into an important competition, then you really want that to be sparkling, then that's the one I would go for. Other things that are on the market, there are some enzymes. One's known as here called Clarity Firm. Malt Miller sells it as NBS Clarity. It is a enzyme that basically causes it chops off the sites of where on protein, I think, where it normally would bind to polyphenols. Doesn't affect anything else like head retention. Supposedly causes gluten reduction, although there's some debate as to whether how effective that is, whether it just gets it below the threshold for testing. But some people, I've heard different things. There are some people which say they're gluten sensitive and they're fine after using it. Other people which are gluten sensitive say they're not. So
that, James, is what we used to use at Westrum at Brewers Clarix, and the threshold for gluten-free beers is 20 parts per million. We used to take our beer down to under 10 parts per million. It does work. It's quite effective, and we've had very many gluten-intolerant people very happy as a result.
It's quite cheap actually, and it's one where again you just add it into the fermenter as you fill it, and then yeah, off it goes and does its job really. Not so good again if you're going to dry hop afterwards, but yeah, it does work very well.
Paul, as a question, Paul, does that affect the flavor if you remove the gluten?
No, we did some tests at one stage between a batch that was brewed with Clarix and a batch that was brewed without, and there was no flavour change or difference at all. It made no difference whatsoever.
Did it make any difference to Clarity?
No, that's the other thing. It didn't. But it did enable us to label the beer as gluten-free.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go on.
So I was just going to ask, does it affect anything else about the beer, like the ABV or the body, or like it strikes me that taking out gluten should be noticeable. I'm like with Jacques. I'm wondering what.
Why not just put it into everything? Yeah,
do.
no, as I said, I mean, there is some debate around it. People that are very sensitive to gluten some people doesn't seem to work for. Other people which are somewhat sensitive, it does seem to work for. So who knows? But yeah, it doesn't affect anything else in any tests that have been done. Like Paul said, I've seen it elsewhere. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And the other thing is, being an enzyme, it's like a tiny dose, and like 5 gallons, you need like about 1.5 mil of it. And I think Malt Miller sells it in like 15 ml bottles for 5 or 6 quid or something. So yeah, it's worth trying. Already mentioned about Browsol. Very effective as well, vegan friendly, very easy to use as long as you mix it in properly. So all works. The other thing with most of these is that they work best when you chill the beer down first. That helps, first of all, precipitate out all of the yeast. Will precipitate out some of the tannins and things like that as well, the polyphenols and tannins on its own. But also then these findings, because you then further strengthen the bond between them, you get the bigger clumps. It makes them easier to drop out. And then for things like chill haze as well, they will only really drop out once you've caused it in the first place. So you need to get the beer down below 5 degrees or whatever your serving temperature is going to be to make it work. In olden times, people used other stuff that came across, I think, from more sort of home winemaking. I've seen like papain, which I think comes from papaya or something like that. I don't need to use that. Bentonite as well, which is some kind of clay, which I think is still used in winemaking. Yeah, don't use those in beer. Yeah, I don't know. Don't think they'll even work because of the differences in pH and things like that. But yeah, plenty of options there. Certainly more than there used to be, and many more available at homebrew level than there used to be. So my quick guide to
James, so I was just going to say, when you say chill it first, do you mean like say Browsol, add that after you've crash cooled to
Yes.
like 4 degrees rather than not bother crash cooling? And
yeah, I would say crash cool it, then hit it with whatever you're finding with. If you don't have to, but it will be more effective if you do it that way. Again, like you won't remove chill haze unless you cause the chill haze in the first place, because like with Browsol, it basically kind of forms a net. They all work like this. They kind of just basically form this net that ends up dropping through the beer, taking everything down with it. So if it's if you've not precipitated the haze in the first place, it's not going to catch it on the way down. It's too small and slips through the holes in the net, basically. Whereas if you precipitate the chill haze by getting it cold, the net will catch it and pull it down. Okay. So using gelatin, fairly quick and easy to use. You can use powder or leaf gelatin. Just don't use vegetarian gelatin. It's not the same thing. Won't work. As I said just now, start off by chilling your fermenter. Get it as cold as you can without freezing it for 24 to 48 hours. Sanitize a container of some form that you can stick in the microwave, or at least take hot water in it. Put 150 ml to 200 ml of water into the jug, and add some of your gelatin. I think I use normally 2 sheets of the 2 or 3 sheets of the Dr. Oetker leaf gelatin that's on the screen there. Or I think a teaspoon of powdered gelatin is about right. With the leaf gelatin, actually, I should say, before you do any of this, you take the leaf gelatin and put it, set it in some cold water for a couple of minutes. It will just help it soften up and then dissolve at the end. And basically, you want to gradually then, once you've put your gelatin into the sanitized jug with the water, microwave it to get it up to 65, 70 degrees. And that is really just to pasteurize it and help it dissolve. don't boil it. If you boil it, it will kind of more turn into jelly, which you don't want. You're just trying to get it properly dissolved and pasteurized. More recently, actually, I found it. If you've got a good thermometer, then another way of doing it is to simply sanitize your jug and then boil the kettle and pour the 200 ml of water straight into that, and it comes out around like 70 degrees straight away. So yeah, and I think I've said 70 degrees in there, 75, 80. Just don't go over 80, I think. Said you definitely. I've heard of other people said, "Oh, boil it and then boil the gelatin," and I'm like, well, it's fine if you're trying to make a jelly or something like that. Then once you've made your solution, stir it into the cold beer, leave it for 48 hours or so. You will have a pint of sludge at the bottom of your keg that will come out on the first pour, and then usually it's pretty sparklingly clear after that, fairly quickly.
I've also had it turn into jelly if you try and bloom it in water that is I don't think I tried to bloom it quickly in water that was about 40 degrees, and it turned into jelly. This is the powdered stuff, so room temperature for the bloom phase.
Yeah. I mean, I've only ever used the leaf gelatin. I've never used powdered. But supposedly the same thing. As I said, I would normally stick the leaf gelatin in cold water, just whilst I'm heating up the water that it's then going to go in. Once you take it out of the cold water and drop it into the hot water, it just dissolves instantly. Like just disappears like magic. And then you know it's worked properly. Anyway, yeah. So other
Jane,
things.
can I quickly ask about the vegan one? The vegan gelatin, you say, it's not the same.
No.
Does it behave differently, or what's the? Obviously, they do sell it. Does it not? Can you not use it the same way?
No. So I think, I mean, obviously there's a difference here, and you're not trying to make jelly. You're trying to clear your beer. I think that vegan gelatin, I mean, obviously it must contain a whole load of collagen in it, but I imagine it's probably from from vegetable sources like.
Yeah, I was
lentils or something.
checking. And actually, like usually for vegetarian gelatin, you have agar-agar, and it's pretty much the same as Irish moss. So, and it actually gives you an answer.
Okay.
I think the property of gelatin that we're looking for is like the charge on it that attracts particles to it. And I think the vegan gelatin, it makes jelly, but it's not charged, so it won't.
I was wondering, I think I watched a Bake Off one where they used it, but they didn't boil it. But if you boil it, it works. But I'm just wondering whether if you boil it, the vegan version, whether it activates that charge. I don't know.
I mean, I've seen I saw a paper, I read a scientific paper in researching for this some time ago, where somebody had done experimented with other forms of collagen. So I think it was specifically the collagen from gelatin that they wanted, and it does exist in other forms, like in peas and things like that. And they sort of use extract of various other things, and it kind of worked-ish, but nowhere near as effective as the ground up cow hooves, not a standard gelatin. Yeah, that's I don't know is the answer, but as Rob has probably got the answer there, and it's to do with the charge and things like that. They work in different ways to make your jelly or whatever else to set things. So try it, Peter. Come back and tell us.
Yeah, I'm gonna go. Beer to ruin, that's fine.
Other things, what else can you do in terms of getting your beer nice and clear? So I mentioned earlier on, there's one thing, just general process. So get the mash pH right, 5.2 to 5.6, something like that. If it's higher, you can end up extracting more tannins from the husks of the malt, and that can cause astringency, but also then haze in your beer. Getting in the right pH will then, obviously the pH falls through fermentation, and will, I think, change the charge on particles again to help them drop out. Yeah, same sort of thing really, avoiding the grain and runnings. make sure you boil the beer. As I said earlier on, if you get a good boil, generally you might not need to add any finings. Case in point here is this wit beer, which is again very, very clear. And now it's been in the keg. This is the very last bit of it, and it's been in the keg for about 5 months at this point. But it was about that clear in about 2 months, and there's no finings in it whatsoever. And it's 40% flake wheat and 10% flaked oats. So all of the things I've said to you about like high haze forming things, I don't know. So yeah, that shows like even with lots of that and no finings, you can end up with a ridiculously clear beer anyway. Just if the rest of your process is good, whether you want it or not. I've got up here cool quickly as one thing. That was certainly back in when I first did this presentation was kind of like a given thing. Like, yes, you should cool your beer quickly because that will help the cold break form and you'll get clearer beer. With the advent of people doing no chill and stuff like that, I'm not so sure anymore. Yeah. So, sorry, Joel, have you got a question?
Yeah, I've got a question. Does like skimming on the boil, does that make a difference? I've heard different things about that. I thought it was apocryphal, but I've heard other people say it does kind of help with the clarity and the sort of head and stuff.
I mean, I know the German sort of traditional brewers are very into it, particularly the Hefeweizen brewers, because they think that stuff adds the sort of the darker stuff on both in the boil and in your Kreuzen adds bitterness and astringency. So, and given those things tend to come from tannins, maybe. But having said that, I mean, also the other things that sort of traditional German brewers do are things like mill your grain underwater and pre-boil strike. Yeah, to go to a lot of lengths to hit particular things. So does it matter or does it do anything? Yes, it probably does do something. Does it matter for us on a small scale? There's a lot of other things you could do first. That's like the last 1/10% to do if you're doing everything else right.
Definitely not at the last 1/10%. So good.
Yeah.
Glad to see that I've been slacking
Perfect
off
everything else and then do it. Once you're brewing like a world-class Hefeweizen or something, then try it. Yeah. So that's all I'd say on that.
Just to add anecdotally, I did a wit beer that also ended up super clear, because I bottle conditioned it for ages because it had some off flavors, which actually also went away. So it was perfect sort of combination.
I did too. I had a beautiful, nice, cloudy Hefeweizen, which turned crystal clear. I was pissed off with that. I didn't want it crystal clear. But on this topic of skimming, I used to skim all the time. And then one day I stopped and it made no difference whatever. So I've stopped because I don't have to dirty the sieve anymore.
Presumably, with the Reinheitsgebot laws, are the Germans not allowed to use finings in the Reinheitsgebot beers? And would that be a reason then to use skimming as a means of removing a bit of protein?
Possibly. Doesn't mean we should do it.
Oh, no, but I'm saying if that was all you were left with as a means, because you couldn't use finings.
I mean, there are things that they can do. So I think that it might have actually been the stuff I was talking about earlier on PVPP, that they could put it in as long as they took it out before they sold the beer. So there's certain things like that they can get around the rules with. Yeah, I'm not sure actually. There's lots of weird things caused by the Reinheitsgebot, but yeah.
Just on the topic of the boil, I was reading that we were talking about coagulation of proteins, and if you've made a wheat beer, you'll probably see it when you boil. It's got all these bits floating around. I was told that best happens at a pH of 5.2. And even if you're mashing at 5.2, doesn't mean the boil is at 5.2. So you might, if you add just a little bit of acid or sometimes just calcium sulfate, add that to the boil. And once you hit that 5.2 sweet spot, you can literally see more proteins coagulate. And then as you cool down, all of those drop. And I think that's maybe where the whole idea comes from of cooling quickly. And if those are not in your beer, that'll also help clarity later on. So boil pH is another one.
Yeah. For me, that comes from getting the mash pH right in the first place. Because if you get the mash pH right, then the boil pH should follow. Yeah, it just works all the way down the line then. What else we got here? So yeah, maybe cooling quickly helps. Who knows? Lagering, as I said, time and cold will get anything clear if you keep it cold enough for long enough. It will eventually clear. Other things you could do, filtering. I don't know of any good homebrew filters really you can use. I mean, there's the sort of bouncer filters and things like that, but they're not really fine enough to be able to properly filter a beer. Plus, it's messy. You get danger of oxygen exposure as well. Yeah, and centrifuging, which is not an option for homebrewers. Maybe somebody will come up with one at some point. Kegland, maybe. They seem to invent everything else at this point. You know, with like I don't know, a drill-powered centrifuge or something would be good. Yeah, they're very expensive, costing tens of thousands of pounds. So not great for us. So do everything else first of all. Yeah.
I tried whirling a full corny keg around my head, but I pulled a muscle. It's not good.
I thought you were going to say you're going to like filling it via like a salad spinner or something like that.
See, look, that's a good idea.
You could take it to the children's playground and put it on the roundabout.
See, it's such a creative community we have. That's why they invented Crystal Weizen as well, Les. That's another creative part of the community.
Crystal meth, more like.
What should we call it? It's supposed to be like this.
All right. What can go wrong in all of this? So yeah, I've said earlier on, pick one kettle fining and one fermentation fining. Mixing up multiple finings can counteract each other. So try one at a time. I mean, once you've mastered one, if you want something better, maybe try adding another one, but don't try throwing in everything all at once. Likewise, don't overdose. Too little is preferable to too much, and that picture on the right hand side is what happens when you overdose your carrageenan protofloc. It kind of, yeah, you end up with some. I think that this would all come out again into a liquid form, but it looks pretty grim in there, doesn't it? It's yeah, that's a massive overdose. But what can happen if you overdo it?
Does that settle out or what happens after that?
I mean,
it looks solid.
Yes, I don't think it is solid. I think it's one of those things where with a bit of agitation, it would all just fall apart straight away. But it looks weird, doesn't it?
More power, Igor. That's like
Yeah.
Mad scientist lab.
So that's an extreme version, but yeah, so don't overdo it. And again, like fermentation fining, you probably in your fermenter want to leave it late. You want to get it cold if you can, first of all, and then just use the fining as a final step. And as with everything else, be careful about what you're throwing into your beer because you don't want to infect it. So yeah, but generally most of these things are very small danger of infection. Yeah. Few myths about fining. That first one really exposes when I originally wrote this presentation. Hazy beer is okay, it's about taste. Well, again, like I don't think the hazy IPAs existed back then, so this changes all that. But as I said at the beginning, I think you drink with your eyes, and clarity can add to the appeal in the right beer. It's not what everybody's looking for anymore these days. There you go. Fining reduces flavour and aroma. I think there is something to that. Again, coming back to the hazy IPA, there is definitely something about those whatever is causing the haze also causes a mouthfeel and also shows an abundance of the hop compounds that give you flavour and aroma. So stripping them out can cause a slight flavour change. Equally, though, it can also cause the beer flavours to come together. If you've had a sort of a murky beer, does not taste anywhere near as clean and as fresh and as bright as a properly clear beer can do. So it's kind of do what you think is best. Try it, see. This is the big one I always see is like the people say that there won't be enough yeast to carbonate your beer if you are bottling it. If you find it and it's clear, and that's not true. It takes quite a lot to remove yeast entirely from a beer. You can have visibly clear beer when there are still 1 million cells of yeast per milliliter in your beer. And I've seen where Belgian breweries I think it's in Brew Like a Monk, it's mentioned that one of the breweries aims for about 300 cells per milliliter to be able to naturally carbonate their beer. So a clear beer can still have plenty enough yeast in it to cause carbonation. And the last one here, the idea that my favorite brewery doesn't find anything. Well, they might still filter or centrifuge. So they might say they don't find their beer, but that doesn't mean they do mechanical means or some process means in some other way. So, and a lot of cask breweries, they don't necessarily need to because they're serving their beer a bit warmer at 12 degrees is the normal, I think the cask mark temperature it's supposed to be, which is generally too warm to have chill haze in your beer. But again, I've had a couple of times where I've had a pint of what's normally a cask ale that's obviously been sat in a keg fridge at 5 degrees and it comes out quite hazy as well as being quite cold. So yeah, there's sometimes a reason. I mean, I guess the answer is really it's fine if you need to, but don't if you don't need to. Right, that's it for fining. Is there any more questions? I can keep talking about going to packaging, things like that, bottling, kegging, that sort of thing. I only got a few on that, but
just one thing about copper findings, James. You said you don't necessarily need to use them. I generally do. It's the only findings I use. And the one time I forgot to use copper findings, the beer dropped bright, but as soon as you touch the bottle, it really, really fluffed up and was difficult to settle down again. So yes, just beware of that. And I'm surprised, Steve, was I correct in hearing you say that your beers took 3 months to drop bright?
Yeah, I think so. I think because I put them straight in the big fridge at 4 degrees, would that make a difference?
I don't know. I'm just thinking about I bottle condition a lot of mine, and they drop bright within about a week, and that's without any findings other than the copper findings.
I've noticed that as well. So anything left over from the fermenter, which is probably like 23 litres in, get 19 litres in the corny keg, and then I stick the remainder in the Cooper's bottles, and they're a smaller. It's a smaller thing. So but they drop clear really quickly.
Yeah.
As well. I mean, there's less distance for everything to drop, I guess, in a small bottle, but you're absolutely right. That does happen. I don't know why it takes such a long time to clear. And obviously, I'm taking from the corny keg. You're taking from the bottom most of the time, so it's the worst place to judge it from, unless you've got a floating thing. But for lagers, I think I probably meant more that it's 3 months. I've done a few bitters recently, and they drop clear like within a few weeks. So
Yeah,
I'm-
the British yeasts that you put in a bitter tend to clump together and drop out. Like the Fuller's one is insane. It's like just I'm done fermenting, and just crystal clear. Like within a couple of days of finishing fermentation.
I've been using SO4 for some bitters, and it's clear in a week from the beginning of fermentation. I was just going to ask something very quickly about the findings. Is there what's better is it better in the boil or better in the fermenter? Is one drop clearer than the other? I mean, if you can do a mix, if you can do it in either, is there one that's better, or is it dependent on the beer style or anything else?
I think just try and see what. I mean, there's different options for different. It's more
Might
to do with
suit
the
the
system
setup.
and the brewer as more than anything.
Okay.
I've said I've gone without findings. I've used just the sort of Irish moss or Protafloc in the boil. Then I've also used the Brew Bright, which I wasn't sure about, but actually was really good and helped the beer drop clear in the keg actually quite quickly as well. So if I was only going to use one, it might be that. I will see with Brew Bright how that goes. I would generally think about it as use one in the kettle, and then use one in the fermenter if you want to kind of polish your beer. If you want to remove like a dry hop haze or any remaining haze, if you want a sparklingly clear lager really quickly, then use a fermenter fining as well. But generally, I would use one in the kettle, moderate amount, and then use it in the fermenter if you need it. But
Kind of
you
what
don't
I've been
need to.
doing, I think. Like you're saying, I do half a Protafloc at the end of every boil, and then that's not always gone clear in the keg, so that's why I was doing a bit of Browsol in the keg as well. But
Yeah, it's the same words I was thinking. It's about polishing. So the Protafloc in the kettle for everything, and then for those beers that you want that extra kind of polish, that extra bit of clarity, gelatin I put in the keg actually, in the corny keg. I don't know if you can see this one. This is a pale ale.
Wow,
that's very clear.
Because people have been like putting up pictures of their Czech Pils or their German lager in our group and on the Facebook groups with the brewing groups and stuff like that, and it's ultra clear. Like, how on earth are you managing to do that? I can't get a lager to drop to appear that clear in within 6 months.
When you see one that is ultra bright,
Is it gelatin?
Gelatin is usually what I would say.
Right.
That's
try
the
and
only
drink
thing that
it
I've
to
had
this.
that's been that good. I mean, the Browsol here is really good, but there is still a tiniest little bit of. I mean, it might be because it's right at the bottom of the keg and I've only just started pouring it. So, but it's very good, but it's just not quite that level of sparkling. You see it like when you pour a beer in a competition, and it's like, oh my god, this thing is like unbelievably clear.
It does make a
like
difference,
glass.
doesn't it?
It's
Talking of competitions, being a vegetarian judge, I'm probably subjecting myself to quite a bit of gelatine.
I don't think a lot, as I said, when people use it, it's really noticeable. But
Yeah.
yes, possibly are.
Wonder whether it's a thing that should be marked up as a. I suppose it's not really an allergen, is it? But it's something that people might not want to
I think that's
consume.
worth asking. Yeah.
That's a good.
I don't know how much you would get though, because it would ordinarily it would come out at the beginning. You know, when you put the gelatin in the keg, it sinks, as James was saying, through the beer.
I think that the thing is that there's still been an animal killed for your beer. That's what,
Ah.
is
We
the
would
use
agree.
of
We
I
totally agree. There was a time we asked about that a couple of years ago for I think it was at Lab Open, and they did ask people to say whether it was vegan or not.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a website, Barnivore, which you can go on for commercial beers to find out whether they're vegan or not. But I must admit, I didn't realise so many people use gelatine in lagers. So
I was vegetarian at this stage and reading about it, and apparently it's only Carlsberg of all the international lagers that don't use isinglass.
yeah, oh yeah, a lot of
really.
a lot of the commercial ones use it.
I thought a lot of them had moved away from anything that was that
IPAs
detract
are
from the
better
being
with.
vegan certified kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, I think it tends to go. Also, I think, to be honest, it's part of the thing with craft beers where they're trying to. It's a different sort of thing where they're trying to improve, say, gluten-free or low gluten or whatever. I think it sort of goes with the territory a bit more, rather than someone like Harvey's who will say we use isinglass because we've always used isinglass or whatever, and it's part of their traditional process.
So I think, I mean, it's one of the reasons why I've like started mucking around with the Brausol, just to see if I can get a beer really or almost perfectly clear, but without having the issues of because I did know that there's a few people in the club and elsewhere that are vegan or vegetarian. So, but yeah, I mean, when it comes to if you want the ultimate in clarity, I would probably go towards using gelatin, particularly for speed, but for bottle swaps and things like that, I think it's important to say on the bottle label if your beer does contain that. Gluten, I mean, you expect gluten in beer.
Yeah, exactly.
But any other allergen other than gluten, and if it's using animal parts of some kind, I think that you should probably say that on your label, because it's important.
Yeah, it would certainly help us.
In terms of Brausol, I buy mine from the Malt Miller. They sell a stupid little bottle of 15 grams of it for £2.50. Don't buy that. They sell a 250 gram pouch of it for £9. Now, given that I use about 7 to 9 mil per batch, that little bottle would cost me £1.25 a dose, whereas I haven't even calculated how much the big pouch costs. Not a lot. It's just so I get 33 doses. So yeah, 27p, 28p for the big pouch, and the stuff has a long shelf life. You don't need to refrigerate it, so I'd say buy the bigger pouch of it rather than the little one. The only difficulty with it is measuring it. Measuring only like 8 or 9 mil of it is you need something small to measure it in.
I use a syringe generally. I've got a 2 mil, a 10 mil, and a 20 mil syringe. That's easiest for measuring. I found that the shelf. I'm not entirely sure how the shelf life is on the Brausol. So I've been using a bottle that's probably a year out of date now, just because you use so little of it. And it's still, I mean, the one I've just had has a bit of a haze in it, but it's still dropped very clear. So maybe it just becomes a little less effective.
Yeah, I guess if you're finding it's not dropping quite clear, then you can always buy a new thing. But the big pouch is kind of a bit of a no-brainer.
I've got a question for the current or previous Pico brewers amongst us. I seem to remember over the last year or so where people have brewed on the Pico. I don't have one, where they said that the sludge that went into the fermenter was quite something, but they have never had clearer beer out of it. I just wondered whether there's any kind of comments or processes that were inherently within that Pico that might have added to that clarity.
Well, I think Peter, the answer lies in the inbuilt circulation system. That's what I would have thought. But yeah, I mean, that was certainly my experience. That the beers I did manage to make were incredibly clear, and this is a system, it doesn't ever actually even get up to the boil, for example, but it's continually recirculating, and I think that probably has a lot to do with it.
I remember you saying that you were quite surprised about the mud that went in and the clarity that came out.
Yeah.
Well, I've seen that elsewhere where like the Brewlosophy that can't find anything of significance in brewing process managed to find a beer was better if you added lots of basically put all the trub into the fermenter. I know that on the commercial side, that's judged as being a bad thing because of, again, shelf stability. It means the beer doesn't have a long shelf life. But again, if that's where people are sticking on a warm supermarket shelf for 6 months, so it doesn't really apply as much to homebrewers, I think.
I mean, that is basically my process when I'm brewing stovetop, is that I cool it down in the sink, just in a water bath, and then when it's cool, it all goes in the fermenter. That's it, all of it. I only ever properly whirlpool if I'm using my big kit, and I've never really had any issues with clarity except for the odd beer. And stability, again, I've not noticed any problems with, say, bigger beers that I've wanted to last a bit longer, not being stable. I mean, the smaller beers don't generally get to see a Sunday, but you know what I'm saying. I think yeah, it's one of these things that's it's become a bit of a brewing myth in a way. You need to keep all this stuff out of your fermenter, and all the indications are that actually you don't.
Cool. Do we want to talk about packaging as well? I've got a few slides on it, but I can keep it for another time. See people nodding. Might as well, I guess.
Yeah. Another beer.
Yeah, let's have a couple of minutes break, and we'll go on with that.
Before you go, can I just ask that you also talk about kind of how they relate to each other, as in like how the clarifying and the packaging relate? Sorry, it's kind of a transitional subject, but for me, like some beers I've only managed to clarify by bottling and bottle conditioning for ages and then just pouring very carefully, basically, which isn't real clarifying.
Isn't it?
Maybe it is. I don't know.
I mean, you get the beer clear. There's not a proper way of doing it.
I'll take that as a win then. I always felt like I was cheating.
But you're not going to be sort of dogmatic about saying you have to brew this way. It's like it's I guess the ends justify the means.
Finings just do it more quickly, don't they? Because age, time will clarify your beer regardless, but finings do it more quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say like a lot of finings are like powdered or liquefied thyme, and that's all that's doing is just speeding up that process. I mean, the lagering came about originally, and because found that if they kept the beer cold for a long time, it warded off the accelerated aging, so it reduced the speed of aging, but also then allowed more and more stuff to precipitate out of the beer to get it ultra clear. And yeah, so you can cold time basically both accelerates that conditioning and that clearing, and finings just further accelerate it.
And that's why many commercial brewers like to use finings, because it means they can get their product out of the market more quickly.
Yeah, on a commercial scale, your equipment is your limit basically. A lot of the biggest commercial brewers, they're trying to push stuff through as fast as they can, because big kit costs money. Stuff sat in tanks is tanks that you can't use for the next batch kind of thing. So it's all about speeding things up, moving it along. We don't necessarily need to worry about that for homebrewing. I mean, I've done a presentation in the past on speed brewing. Maybe I'll revisit that one in the future. But we don't need to generally push things along too fast.
But does clearing a beer, like say commercially, Paul, or even homebrew scale, that gets you to the final flavor much quicker because all of the other stuff that you don't want has dropped out, whether it be yeast or bits of protein or whatever it is. But is that kind of the point of the findings ultimately in the first place, if you like, that you get it, everything you don't want drops out by whatever means you have to do it the quickest, so that you can either drink it or sell it in the condition it's supposed to be in. So fining helps the flavor, then helps you get to the final flavor more quickly, more than being clear, if you see what I mean. Is that why?
Is that aimed at someone, Steve?
Sorry, no, maybe Paul or yourself. Just because Paul's done it commercially, so finings clear the beer, which improves the flavour and improves the appearance. And
yeah, the ultimate goal of the commercial beer is consistency, and consistency as quickly as possible. So if finings enables that, then yes, you're absolutely right, Steve. But from a homebrew's point of view, I love the development in the flavour of the beer, right from the very green beer to a mature beer. So I like that process. So I'm not necessarily keen on it getting to the end point as quickly as possible.
I mean, to add to that, I would say for ethical breweries like Paul works for, it's about consistency. For Scumbag multinational. Oh, sorry, you have worked for. For Scumbag multinational breweries, it's about profit, and tying up your equipment is costs energy. It's again, you need to buy bigger equipment so you can put more through it. So they invent all kinds of interesting ways. Like Budweiser's famous, I think it's like beechwood slats or something that they put the beer through, and it helps clear it very quickly. I don't know how. But then they do other things like get the beer down to like -1, because again, the cold just accelerates that process very, very quickly. And so yeah, they can do all sorts of things like that to speed it up.
I have to rewatch that episode of Inside the Factory with Greg Wallace, where they go to the Carlsberg brewery and see their process. Absolutely insane. It's an insult to homebrewing, but it's an amazing commercial process. It goes through like a dozen filters with flour instead of all grain mashing. It's just squeezed into beer, and then
they put in more calcium chloride than hops.
I think there's the bit where he shows the amount of hops that goes into whatever it is, a bazillion barrels, and it's like a gram or something.
Yeah.
It's insane.
How many decoctions do they do?
Crazy. Very interesting episode though.
He also recently did one at the Guinness Brewery, which is also very interesting.
Really good, really good. I watched that as well. It was really, really interesting.
Home brewing on that multinational scale is kind of a marvel. Not for, but it's a different thing to, I think, what we're doing. It's a commodity that just there for average consumption. It's kind of a, so yeah, it's a different entire. I think it's almost a different product that you're doing at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
But it's I don't think there's a lot we can learn from it, personally. So, but there you go.
I guess back to your question, Steve, when you look at the processes that some of the German and Czech breweries still use, it would make sense that other breweries are using fining simply to get there quicker. because there aren't many breweries that are up for the kind of barrel storage of Pilsner Urquell or that. No one's doing that kind of stuff, are they?
No, you want it as clear as possible, don't you? As quickly as possible, and whatever it costs, whatever it needs to get there, I guess. Because it does look nice. A clear lager is a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Depends
Yeah,
on
I'll
how
quite-
much people are willing to pay for it.
I quite often I do 2 kegs for every batch, and the first batch I'll use a floating dip tube and I'll use gelatin, so I get there quicker. And then the second keg I won't use anything, and it's got a dip tube, just like how it's evolved. And that one I'll leave in the fridge a lot longer, and by the time it's ready, it's the same as the first.
So is there any difference between the flavor or your appreciation of them or whatever?
By the time I get round to the second keg, I think I'm tasting it. I think I can taste age more than I can taste any difference between whether it's been fined or not. But equally, I agree with James in that when I brew a lager and I leave it in the fridge for, I don't know, a month or whatever, and like Paul, I love tasting it through all the different stages. I don't particularly like the early stages for a flavor, but I like seeing how it changes, and you can see it clearing, and you can taste how much clearer the flavors are becoming when it starts off really murky, and then they just get brighter and brighter, and all the malt separates and the hops, and it's literally like a new clearing as the beer clears. So there's definitely something in that.
Yeah. It's a really good education to see it develop like that, exactly as you say. And I think Paul was saying as well that it comes together. You can see it and taste it and smell it come together into one beer at the end, whereas at the beginning it's the separate ingredients, a bit like a chili or a curry or something like that. The flavors all come together at some point. Takes a while, but it's worth the wait.
Cool. Should I go on with the second part then? Bit on packaging. Got here. So I mean, these slides are put together fairly quickly. So I hope they're okay. But this was more as a sort of framework to have a chat about rather than any particular level of expertise. So, right. So what are the options? On the smaller side, we've got smaller pack side, we've got bottling and canning. And then going up through the sort of cost and size of things, you have your pressure barrel, your mini kegs, corny kegs, and then the sort of Sankey and commercial kegs, the sort of biggest and I guess most expensive end of things. Any others people can think of? I mean, I've got mini kegs, and then I kind of mean like the 5-litre kegs that are that you can buy from commercial breweries these days a bit. But I guess there's sort of the smaller cornies as well that are 5-10 litre kind of things as well, which are also called mini kegs confusingly.
Cask, James, cask.
Casks, of course. Sorry, terrible.
Or barrels. I mean, wooden barrels.
Yeah, served straight from a barrel. Yeah, I mean, I guess you got cask. You've got the things like the poly pins and things like that now. So you sort of bag in a box kind of thing. Yeah, I hadn't. Unfortunately, I put these together fairly rapidly. So I haven't covered those particular things, but I'll be somebody else can fill in as we go.
There's also just leaving it in the fermenter.
You're just drinking it from the tap in the fermenter, Joe.
Well, you can if you've got a pressure fermenter. You can carb it.
Okay.
Lying on the floor.
Yeah, you could use it as a bright tank, couldn't you? Or you can get bright tanks, can't you?
Yeah, uni
Aerosol.
tanks. So yeah, I haven't gone into those things as well, but we can perhaps discuss where they sit in relation to other things as we go through. So I guess the first place where most people start, and maybe never go on from, is bottling. And that's generally because it's cheap. It's the cheapest way of serving your beer, I think. All you really need to buy is a capper and some caps, or if you get swing top bottles and from somewhere, then you don't even need the caps or the capper, but generally you need to buy one or the other. But yeah, you can use commercial bottles and just use a capper and some crown caps. So it's very, very easy to do. I found actually personally that when I was bottling more, that the crown caps were actually a big benefit in that they have a liner in them that helps absorb oxygen. I've actually did a batch where I found that all the bottles that had crown caps on them came out the color I was expecting of a lager I'd made. Whereas all of the bottles in all of the swing top bottles came out a few shades darker. I assume due to oxidation, and that the crown caps had saved the crown cap bottles, but not the same for swing tops.
Just out of interest, James, were those beers bottle conditioned or were they bright?
Yes, they
because
were.
if you bottle conditioned, then the yeast will absorb some, if not all, of the oxygen.
Yes, they were bottle conditioned, and I think that it's one of those things where the yeast will consume some of it, but there is the possibility you can cause even. And obviously, my bottling process was causing more oxidation than could be mopped up, and in this case, then the crown cap saved me. To the point when I'm bottling these days, even from a keg with CO2 and everything, I'd stick to crown cap bottles for that reason, because I want to minimise the oxygen in there. It's completely.
As an aside, the crown caps also absorb aroma, hop aroma.
Oh, really?
Well, I think I read about it in Janish's book, New IPA. I think that's where I saw it. But he's got some research he's pointed to. So, yeah. So I think that the research is actually cited in there where they looked at the amount of hop aroma coming out of the beer. And those beers that were in bottles using these crown caps had a lot less. And it was an astounding difference, actually.
Ooh, I found
they absorb the volatile oils or something. So you can end up with an awful lot less aroma.
Crown liners on the inside of caps can absorb some of the hop compounds.
There we go.
Measurable.
The most impacted were the more volatile and green and woody compounds. They were ended up only found in the liners and not in the beer. Fruity alcohols didn't migrate to the liners, but some fruit-forward esters did. There you go.
That sounds really strange, because is it leaving the beer in the bottle? Is it fizzing out, hitting the top and not falling back? Does that, if you had a can, does that mean hop aroma is popping out into the little bit of air and falling back into the beer?
It's literally like the liner inside the cap is like a sponge that can absorb certain things. So it will absorb oxygen, but it sounds like it also absorbs other things. So, I mean, and then once you've absorbed, so if you absorb the oxygen from the headspace, it's possible that other oxygen will migrate out of the beer into the headspace to equalize that, the concentration. And I guess if it's absorbing these certain hop aromas from the headspace, then the same thing would happen there. And given that these things are in minuscule quantities, quite potent, yeah, that's interesting thing to read. I hadn't got, that's near the end of the book. I hadn't got that far, but I'll have to now.
And the research is quite good because it actually gives you some metrics, and it's scary how much it absorbs.
I will say, I've bottled a hazy IPA and compared it left it on a warm shelf for 2 weeks and then compared it to the keg version. And with a good counter pressure filler and those crown caps, I wouldn't have been able to tell the difference in a sort of triangle test. They were so close. I did pick up a very slight difference, but it was so slight that I think if I was blinded to it, I probably wouldn't have picked it up.
This
So
might be the difference between
maybe.
what you experience and what you can measure, because sometimes you can measure stuff, but actually you don't experience it in the same way.
The other thing I do as a matter of routine when bottling is just flush it out with a bit of CO2. I think which helps possibly.
Yeah, I do that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a tip. If you can do it, then I would definitely do that. Counter pressure fillers and beer guns, things like that, have a CO2 button on them to do that. But also to pre-pressurize the bottle, but also means you can flush it a little bit CO2.
I do that.
It helps.
I do that the cheap way with a PET bottle and a carb cap.
Yeah.
And fill under pressure from the fermenter that way. For hobby beers, if it's a bitter or a dark beer, then I'll just use a bottle wand into glass.
Just a quick one on the going back to the yeast and oxygen. As far as I was aware, yeast only consumes oxygen when it's replicating, whereas i.e. when it's trying to grow, which it doesn't do when it's in a bottle because it's already at its critical mass and is just fermenting the extra sugar that's put in there.
So yeasts go through multiple phases. So just a couple of things. So fermentation is yeast growing continuously. The yeast don't grow and then ferment. They are the whole time. That's their point. They don't care about making alcohol or nice tasting beer. Yeast care about replicating. One of the early phase that you go through is the log phase, where they will replicate faster, that is in the presence of oxygen or sufficient sterols. And so what they'll tend to do is they'll go like, right, we're going to go as fast as we can whilst we've got these things available, because they want to replicate as fast as they can. And they are actually fermenting during that phase. And so you quite often see like a rapid decrease in gravity if you're monitoring it initially, and then it drops off a bit once they get past that phase. So they will absorb oxygen and they will ferment at the same time, and then they kind of level off and they continue fermenting, but they're not sort of replicating as fast anymore, because it's kind of like, because oxygen is or sterol availability is the limiting factor on their growth. They can only store so much. It's kind of like initially when they've got it available to them in oxygen or packaged in dry yeast, they'll go as fast as they can to use up as much of it as they can. And then they kind of have to rely upon their reserves and so not ration themselves out, but they slow down a bit. So there is definitely a case that that some yeast is picked up during bottle re-fermentation. How much? It's not unlimited. So there is, from my experience, there's definitely a limit. But equally, I've seen other people, I've seen it in competitions, I've seen it at lab, where people have not added sugar or anything to their bottles, and as a result, they get a slightly oxidized beer coming out of the bottle at the end. That's quite flat. So I'm sure that it's picking up some oxygen, but it's not unlimited.
It is only a small amount, which you've kind of alluded to yourself by suggesting you minimize headspace before capping.
Yeah, that's kind of one of my big tips on it is, if you look at commercial bottles, actually around the base, let me just try and dig one out here somewhere. Hopefully it'll have numbers on it. yeah, there's some bottles have these little bumps on them. Don't know if you can see that. Others have actual numbers on them. Here's a good one. And try and see if I can see what's on here. This one, if I can get the camera to focus on it. I'm not sure if you can see that. It says 17 millimeters. I believe that is the height from the brim of the bottle that you're supposed to fill it to commercially. We don't need to do that. I would fill it a bit higher. I would say within 5 mil of the lid is enough. You need to leave a space for the liquid to expand, and because you want somewhere for the gas to go initially before it dissolves into the beer. But so don't fill completely full, but minimize the headspace, because that will minimize the oxygen that's available to go into your beer. And if you use a crown cap, that can pick up the rest of it. So that
yeah, I think on the Homebrew forum, somebody actually did do an experiment. I remember it, where they had the same beer bottled, but with varying amounts of headspace from 0.5 centimetre through 1 and 2 centimetres, and just took a photo every 2 or 3 weeks, or whatever it was. And you definitely saw, along with more headspace, getting darker more quickly. And the one with only 0.5 mil of headspace, sorry, 0.5 centimetre of headspace, survived quite healthily, which might suggest that that's kind of how much oxygen gets used up by the yeast. I don't know.
Yeah, so actually looking at this bottle, it says 330 ml at 47 millimeters. So basically, when you fill 47 millimeters from the top, that's your 330 ml fill. So that's where they will aim for when they're filling the bottles commercially. But we don't need to do that. I would try and fill it, said 5 to 10 mil from the top, to try and minimize the oxidation you can get. Just on the negatives of bottling, cleaning bottles is a ball ache. It's that I got out of it, and my wife hated having bottles sitting around all the time, because you kind of leave them to one side and then clean a few. I've moved, when I do use them these days, I will leave them on the side, but then I will sort of clean them next day. These days, generally my cleaning is I stick some hot water in along with 1/2 teaspoon of Chem Clean or PBW, leave it to sit for an hour or so, give it a good shake, and then rinse it out. That's good enough. If you're bottle conditioning in your bottles, if they're dirty, you will start to see kind of this film form on the inside of the bottle that the yeast sticks to. You'll actually be able to see it stick to it. So you know that your bottles aren't completely clean then if that's happening. So it does help. You do need to do more than a hot water rinse, I would say. Definitely stick some PBW or carbonate or whatever you've got in there, to give it, and possibly give it a little bottle brush each time. Keep it nice and clean. And that stops the sort of biofilm forming on there that the yeast can stick to. So yeah, clean as you go, or maybe you prefer to just stick them all to one side and have a big bottling day, but I always found that a bit of a pain. Up to you, really. In terms of actually bottling, though, if you don't have any kind of keg or anything else like that, then as we just said, fill near the top, and perhaps even skip the bottling bucket. I used to go to a bottling bucket and then from that to the bottles, and again, I think that's probably contributing to oxidation. These days, if I was going to do it, I would put sugar directly, so just a set amount of sugar directly into each bottle, or a sugar solution that I can then put in with a syringe, and then I'll bottle from the fermenter. Skip the sort of step that's going to cause any further oxidation if I can.
Except the other way you could do that, if you like to mix your sugar with the beer before you bottle it, as I do. Sanitize a keg, fill it full with your sanitizer, and blow it out with carbon dioxide. And then what I do is use gravity to drop the beer from the fermenter into the keg, and then the gas host I have reconnected back up to the fermenter. So you've got a closed transfer basically, and that works pretty well. And I've got 200ml syringe, which I use to syringe the sugar solution in through the outpost before the beer goes into the keg.
Yeah, I mean, the ultimate form of bottling is basically bottling from a keg. But obviously with that, then you then need to get into buying a corny keg and a CO2 tank and all those lovely things. And I kind of was trying to stop short of talking about that. But yeah, I mean, when the last time I bottled was that basically I put all the beer into a corny keg, and then bottled it direct from there. But I have CO2 available to do that. So yeah. The other option for small pack these days is canning, which is quite cool. I'll say that the cans look cool and everything, even if some competition organisers don't like them in their competitions. But I think that has been bridged these days, and nobody really cares too much. Problem with cans is that it requires expensive equipment. You need an expensive can seamer. Cans themselves are single use. They take up a lot of space and get sort of any little dents in them obviously show up. So yeah, a pallet full of cans is fine, but until you have to use half of your garage to store them. The good side with them is that they are almost indestructible for shipping. So if you do need to send them to other people wherever, you could probably just stick a stamp on a can and stick it in the post box and it will get there okay. I've had, during COVID, I bought like a pallet or a box of beer, and it was basically 24 cans, I think it was, with just a single layer of cardboard. And it arrived and it had obviously been dropped on one corner, and literally like one of the 400ml cans had been caved into about 300ml, and it was still fine. So I was like, okay, yeah, you can do anything to these and they'll probably be fine. So yeah, if you want to ship a lot of beers to other people, then canning is probably the ultimate form. It's just the expense of it, really. And to another extent as well, I think if you don't have CO2, that big opening on the top of a can invites oxygen ingress. If your beer is not carbonated, you can carbonate, but really this canning is you need carbonated beer, because then the foam that's produced keeps the oxygen out of it, and then you just sort of slip the can lid on top, seam it, and you're fine. Yeah. Well, actually, I should have said that actually for bottling. One of the tips I would say is if you can do anything to create some foam, natural carbon dioxide foam in your beer when you're bottling it, that's ideal. So if you say add a little bit of sugar to it, put it into a pressure barrel or something like that, and then bottle it from there, that's perfect, because the foam that's coming out of the neck of the bottle when you cap it is pure carbon dioxide, so you've got no oxygen in there whatsoever. That goes from sort of canning from from bottling from a keg as well. So yeah, if you have something like, you could buy a secondhand cheap corny keg from someone. You can sometimes see them around for 30 quid or so. Put the sugar in there, let the beer carbonate for a day or two, then bottle it from there. And you can, and if you can figure out a way of getting it under gravity, then if you can get a bit of foam coming out the neck of the bottle, then you're definitely well protected from oxygen at that point.
So
has anybody got a canning system?
Yeah, that was my question. How much does it cost? It's like 800 quid, isn't it? For the cheapest versions.
So yeah, I've got a canning setup. Yeah, there's so many different ones. The one I've gone for is the Mocktober design, which is powered by a drill, so there's no actual motor in it. So that works quite well. But yeah, the cans, they work out about sort of 30 pence each if you buy them from the malt miller. You've got to buy them in a box of like 240. So it does take up a bit of space, but luckily I got a big attic. So
Does it
that's
take up any more space than that same amount of bottles then? For example.
Probably not. Probably not. But of course, you've got to buy that amount, whereas with the bottles, you could just have as many as you need.
Yeah, just rinse one out. You can't really reuse the cans, I guess, but
So yeah, the fill-in of it is a bit of a little bit of a potch, you know, getting it. Because what you obviously, when you fill in a bottle, you can see what the level is. But obviously with a can not being opaque, you can't see where the level is. So I use a growler filler adapter on my Intertap, and then fill from the bottom. But then it's like, okay, I get the foam coming out of the top, but it's like how much liquid is actually in this, so I end up weighing the can. But I haven't got it out of the box yet, but I have got a duo filler. So that's like a semi-automatic thing. So it's got like 2 tubes. And you put the can into the tubes into the can effectively. One's gas, you push a button, pushes the gas through, and then the other fills. And as the liquid comes up the tube, you preset it to where you want it to stop. And then it's going to stop at this particular point, and then everyone should be the same. Like I say, I haven't got that out of the box yet, so we'll see how we get on with that.
That sounds like a presentation to me, Mark.
Well, yes, when it's set up, I would think so, yeah.
How to can. I mean, it's a thing, right? I mean, it's going to get cheaper and more ubiquitous, and it's appearing in competitions.
Yeah, I'm pleased when a competition is doing cans. I mean, obviously the Nationals didn't do cans, although I did go there on Saturday and I did spot a can in one of the boxes somebody sent in. But I know when Sarah's talked about this before, she said, well, effectively she thinks that's unblinding an entry and that they'd probably get feedback but wouldn't actually be in a position to, win anything. I don't know what happened on Saturday because I didn't get into it, but I could see that there was a canned entry. So yeah.
Does it only unblind it because people know who the few canners are?
Well, that's the theory, but of course, as it gets more and more popular, then that's not going to be the case.
I think very early on, maybe, but even then, it's like, well, don't tell people. Like I don't.
Yeah, I've shot myself in the foot, haven't I?
Well, I think we had a debate about. I mean, I think it's one of these things that the expense will probably prevent it being a sort of something that a lot of people do for a while. But that said, if you don't start allowing competitions, you'll never get that pool of people who are doing it that will start to blind it again. And I think we are starting to get a point where you're seeing enough of them that it's not so much a consideration. And I think probably for those of us in the judge community, people are pretty responsible about recusing themselves if they're worried they know who brewed the beer. If you're entering something in a, as best as we try and sort of blind our entries, but if you're entering something into a fruit or a sort of spice, or you've got a particular Brett thing that you're doing, you have to try very hard, I think, you basically to make sure no one knows what that beer is, to keep it blinding. And there's always one or two people who've, spoken about the recipe or something, and may have to recuse themselves if they see that beer turn up. And I think, a lot of it just does rely on people, being good citizens.
I think that's a really good point, that it's not just the cans, it's your process or what the kind of beer you produce makes you known for that kind of thing. And it's not necessarily just canning. Whatever. No, so I think it's a really good point.
Yeah, I mean, even bottle caps could be an issue. I mean, I use like the malt Miller ones and religiously put black marker pen over it, and then I'm thinking maybe I'm the only one who's actually put black marker pen over the top of a malt Miller cap. But
I recognise Mark Hopkins Sharpie.
I noticed on Saturday they were like Union Jack ones and all sorts of things, you know. So I think that's blinding more than, you know, a plain silver or black or whatever it is can.
Well, I think like as long as it's not got your personal logo on it, then and it's the same thing for putting it in a can. It's like it's in a silver can. Unless it's got your logo or something on it, it's not unblinding it.
I always stick a Bitcoin on top of mine. That works.
My strategy is only bring the bottles on the morning of judging. That solves all the problems.
The cold ones are Rob's.
Yeah.
The cold ones that have been all shaken up.
Can I do a beer swap with whoever's putting bitcoins on the top of their beers? That's
only
worth it.
Only for competition.
On the subject of the cost of it, have people ever thought of like just doing it as a one-off, like for a particular beer? You know, I've thought of that, like where it was like, I don't know, something where I thought if I bottled it from a hops perspective, like the hops are gonna fade too much, and I thought canning might, like if I sent it somewhere to get it canned. I mean, just sort of theoretically. There's also, I thought of this because of, I'm sure that last time in December, Nick from Mashton sort of vaguely offered to let people do canning there.
Yeah,
I don't know what he was thinking. Yeah, maybe I misheard that, but maybe other people know what the offer would be.
No, I remember him saying that. He suggested it. I asked him how much it would be. He couldn't give me a price, but he said, you bring in a keg of your beer, he'll can it for you.
Yeah, I mean, that would definitely be like a attractive offer if there was some beer that I thought wasn't going to do well with bottling, and also if I wanted to send it somewhere, you know, just be quite interesting. Just try it as a one-off.
I think that ultimately, good bottling beats not good canning. Cans have become popular on a commercial scale because of their multiple reasons. They're stackable. They are, as I said, quite indestructible. So a little dent does not mean broken glass everywhere. So they're easier for transport. They're lighter than glass, which is particularly important for commercial breweries because again the cost of shipping. And the other side is you put a big color label on them. They look good.
And
So
you can get away with charging the same price as a 500 for 440 or 330, or am I being cynical?
Well, I would say they also, you've got no problem with skunking from light, have you, with a can as opposed to a bottle?
Yeah.
And of course, they also take up less volume if you've got a crate of cans, because of the neck and so on the bottle, and of course the aluminium is recyclable. I mean, of course, they're only one shot for us lot, but environmentally, they're much better from the shipping, the weight, and all of that.
Yeah, I think Andy Parker said on one of the beer things we did with him, beer tasting we did with him, they were like they're infinitely recyclable. So yeah, it's good from that point of view.
To be honest, I think glass bottles as a homebrew is one of the best recycling things you can do. I get a glass bottle, it never leaves my house unless I give it to someone, and they probably also a homebrew, and it just recycles in the community. It's whereas a can you actually do throw away.
And commercially over here, I don't think we've been used to recycling glassware for a long time, not since Corona or R. White's lemonade bottles. But in Germany, don't they still charge a deposit on bottles and they are reused?
They do, yeah. You can take them back to the supermarket, post them through the machine, and you get a money off voucher for the till.
I wonder whether as well for especially given some of the more modern styles, if as a small brewery now you supply a shop with bottles and you end up with a bottle bomb for whatever reason on your pastry fruited stout or whatever, they're not going to be in a hurry to stock you again, and you'll quickly get a rep, I suspect. But if you put it in a can, you know, it's a lot safer. A lot
Yeah,
safer.
I've heard more issues. One is breakage, and the other is the cost of shipping, and the cans are so much lighter. And because we're not sort of drinking locally and recycling in that way, the cans have just kind of won out that way. So
There have been issues of exploding cans though in the past, but for that very same reason you mentioned, Ian, that things maybe haven't finished fermenting when they were canned, and I think a couple of breweries got egg on their face.
Yeah, it tended to be people adding fruit, from what I gather. The fruited beers were the
Or eggs, in fact.
right. They were. I gather that there were warnings going out on our brewery on the Reddit site about being careful about secondary
IPA.
And it was
anyway, so the small pack stuff, the good stuff about it is, yeah, you've got those little things, and you can chill them down individually as and when you want them. So you're not taking up tons of fridge space. Very cheap to get into with bottling. I mean, I don't know what kind of. I've got like this steel capper which I bought 2011. And still looks pretty much exactly the same the way it did then. So I think I spent about £9 on it then, and it's still the same. And they still sell them, very good. I know there's cheaper options you can get for a few pounds. You can buy one which is, I think you need a hammer you put the crown cap on it, and then you hit it with a hat. Yeah, I'm like, why would anyone buy one of those? But just anyway, so yeah, very cheap, very easy to get into, minimal refrigeration. On the negative side, you've got bottles sitting everywhere, and they're a pain in the arse to clean. Yeah, that side of it. So
if anyone ever wants any, please let us know. We've got hundreds of the things.
They're all clean.
But that's it as well. When you get like, oh, you got a nice German lager bottle. All the German bottles, because they're being recycled or being reused, are all nice, thick, heavy glass. And I'm like, I can't throw that one away. The labels all come off with a bit of hot water, and you're like, oh yeah, use that. Anyway, so
can I just ask you? Sorry, just one thing in terms of sanitation and so on and so forth. I've been in the habit of just like, I clean them straight away when I drink from them, but then for the sanitation, I just put them in the dishwasher. Is that really, cutting too many corners? I mean, I feel like actually it gets up to very high temperature. Like, I don't know about like, do I really need to put them through a, PBW or something like that?
How are you cleaning them?
I clean them straight, like.
Yeah, but what are you cleaning? How are you cleaning them?
I'm not like manually cleaning them at any point. Basically, once I drink from them, I'll like, as in there's reusing bottles that, I'll just rinse it out straight away. And then I only clean them in the dishwasher. That's it. I don't do anything else.
So
unless there's a visible residue.
So from experience, the issue with doing that is that actually you don't remove the biofilm on the inside of the bottle, and over time you do that 2 or 3 times, you'll actually then see if you naturally carbonate your beer, you'll end up with seeing yeast form on the inside of the glass where it's sticking to the biofilm, showing you that your bottle is not clean. The simplest thing to do in this case is to put a bit of PBW or ChemClean or whatever else you'll put carbonate into there with some hot water. Doesn't need to be kettle hot. In fact, if it is, it might break the bottle on you. So just like sort of tap hot water with a little bit of PBW, leave it to soak, give it a good shake, rinse it out. That should do enough. If you want to go to town, then you can use a bottle brush, but you shouldn't generally need to do that. If you keep hitting it with a proper cleaner like that, a cleaning agent, it should be fine.
My preferred cleaning agent is chlorinated caustic, or the commercial product is Antiformin S from Murphy and Sons, and really dirty bottles, you can watch it dissolve away. It really is that effective. And then it's just a quick rinse with hot water afterwards, then sanitize before it gets anything else in it.
Do you wear rubber gloves when you're doing that, Paul?
Don't wear rubber gloves. I have glasses naturally, so yes, you're right to raise the awareness about the dangers of strong chemicals like that, because I have seen nasty burns from caustic and peracetic acid as well. So yes, absolutely right, James.
Yeah, caustic will dissolve organic stuff, including your skin, left on strong enough, long enough. But it's so yeah, I would always be wary of it. But the PBW, Chem Clean, that sort of stuff is pretty effective when hot. So that's kind of what I'd recommend. Putting it in the dishwasher will sanitize the bottles.
So I was going to say, talking about caustic, there was one important lesson I learned. Not all plastics are caustic safe. I've used caustic many times, and I used it on one occasion to clean out the metal pipes through my beer chiller, and to do that I used a drinks bottle, a fizzy drinks bottle, to put the caustic in, and with a pressure cap, carbonation cap, to attach it to my CO2 keg. And the plastic drinks bottle dissolved. I wasn't in the brew shed at the time, luckily. I just heard a very loud hissing sound from outside. And when I opened the door, kind of a litre or so of strong caustic solution had sprayed out of pinholes out of the bottle throughout the brew shed, took the varnish off all the walls. Nasty. But other plastics are okay, so just a warning that you might get away with it most of the time, but just occasionally avoid drinks bottles.
Fun.
Thought it was worth mentioning as you spoke about caustic.
Yeah, no, I'm always careful. Be careful.
Yeah, gloves wouldn't have helped there.
Yeah, so just saying, finally, in terms of sticking them in the dishwasher, you're unlikely to get a squirt of water up inside the bottle, so it's not going to clean it. It will heat sanitize it, but it's not going to clean it. So the whole thing about it is you want to clean, then sanitize. Clean with a cleaner inside of the bottle, potentially then, or you rinse it out. And then if you want to, before using it, give it a squirt of Star San inside is what I do. Let that drain out for a minute or two. That'll be nice and sanitary. Although generally, as you can see with this bottle, I clean it. I then stick one of these little plastic caps on it to keep dust and everything else out of it. It's probably going to be fine to use it like that way, but I just give it a couple of squirts of Star San just in case anyway. I've not really had any issues doing that way. And the effort's fairly
the good
minimal.
thing about a dishwasher is the steam you get from it as well. Like super good at sanitizing. Like obviously it won't clean anything, but steam is much better at killing microbes than even just dry heat or anything like that. It's the closest thing you've got in your house to an autoclave. So
I have a fairy liquid and a bottle brush.
Yeah.
After I've
Then
drunk
the
it, then rinse it out, leave it upside down. And
Yeah, to be fair, actually, fairy liquid is extremely effective. You don't want to leave the detergent on the bottles, but it breaks down over time.
I stick all my bottles in the oven. I leave it at about 150 degrees for 2 hours. The big reason is I've got lots of sour beers and the bottles just mix up, and I can't put something that's had PDO into another bottle. So I always basically overkill every single time. Yeah. So I first leave it to rinse in some PBW, then let it to dry, and then put it in the oven, and then they need to cool down before I can actually bottle. Yeah. it's a lot of energy, but yeah.
So James, have you got any examples there of what not to use for bottling your beer?
Like,
Did you see what I posted yesterday from the competition?
oh, yours one in like the Fanta bottles. Ugh, yeah. I've seen the same thing with like, yeah, rather use proper bottles. And if you're gonna use glass ideally because it's pretty much impermeable. If you're not, then you got the plastic PET bottles, which are brown PET bottles. But then I've seen like the sort of Panda Pop 250 ml PET bottles, which quite often they end up arriving oxidized.
I've used those to good success in when we had our inter-club competitions during COVID, actually. And I was thinking of going back to them, but instead of using the caps that come with them, buying the Cooper's oxygen scourging caps. Because as long as you keep the bottle out of the light, you've got an oxygen scourging cap on it, it should be okay. I mean, I don't make enough beer these days that I want to send in, you know, 1.5 litres of beer to a competition. So if I can get that down somehow to below 1 litre by sending in 330s that aren't glass, that would be the way to do it, because you can't seem to get hold of PETs that are 330 ml size.
No, and the one thing I will say is that some of these PET soft drink bottles are gas permeable.
Mhm.
They definitely are, because I've left one for quite a long time before, and it went all squishy. So something had escaped. So yeah, they're not. I think glass is probably the gold standard, but again,
Certainly for
like
long term, you only want to use glass, definitely.
yeah,
If you're
but
keeping
again,
a bit.
for quick transporting, these things are again indestructible.
Yeah.
You could stick a stamp on it, stick it in the post box, never get there. So they're great as well.
Yeah. But definitely don't reuse a Fanta bottle and then underfill it as well.
Yeah. Let me finish. We've been talking a long time this evening. Kegs, cheap kegs. There are cheap options. Pressure barrels. I actually really like them. As a starter option. You see they're high density, thick plastic. That you fill it up with beer, naturally carbonate it, and then you have a little tap on the front which squirts it out, and actually gives a pretty nice cask-like pour. Because of when you fill the thing up, the amount of headspace compared to the amount of liquid is very small. They're very good at avoiding oxidation as well. So they're quite good actually initially for hoppy beers and things like that. The one thing you don't want to do with them is then when you open up the tap, when the pressure starts to run out, so when the beer's not flying out of the tap, the difficulty with these things is that getting the carbonation right is a bit of a trick. Initially, the beer actually sprays out, which does give you a nice cask pour. But when it starts to run out of carbonation, you end up with air will glug back up through the tap and into the keg, and obviously then that's going to start to oxidize your beer. You can get them where instead of naturally carbonating, you can also you naturally carbonate, but then you can top it up with CO2. That used to be from the S30 Hamilton Bard cylinders, which are, I think, only available from one outlet in the UK, if that anymore. But you can get adapters for SodaStream cylinders now instead, and they work really well. And that you can basically it has a little needle valve on the end of it, and you just sort of prod it onto the top of the valve on the barrel. It gives it a quick squirt of CO2 in, and you can keep filling it that way. So I do really like them. The only other negative I found with them is that the rubber seals on them do need changing every 2 or 3 years. I'd say every couple of years, if I'm honest, because they end up perishing and then either leaking oxygen in or your beer out. Neither is good. have actually found though that where I looked for refurbishing one recently, and those seals are getting harder and harder to find. So how much longer we'll see them around, I don't know. Similar option is the 5 litre mini keg, which is a little picture I've got on the bottom right here. You get them from some brewery selling their cask beer in a bigger amount. You can buy them for homebrew. You can buy a tap and thing that takes like little CO2 bulbs to help dispense it. The tap is the Party Star Deluxe tap. Does not have great reviews when I've seen it. I've not used one myself, but people don't seem to like it. I think these little kegs, they're only 5 litres in size. They're probably good for taking beer to a party that's going to get drunk that evening and just serve it on gravity. I wouldn't use them for keeping long term, and I've heard other things about them rusting and things like that. So
I did a 5 points best, and I used 2 mini kegs for that. I put 5 litres in each. One I put on my hand pull for a party, and the other one I just left in the fridge, and they're both conditioned with sugar in the keg. And the one I left it in the fridge for over a year. Then we had it one evening when some mates came round, and it was lovely. Still, I was really surprised that it lasted that long. It's very good. You can build. I made a little sort of adapter with a gas and liquid post that does a similar thing to that Party Star tap, that you just push it through the valve thing at the top, and you can put disconnects on it, which is how I used it on the hand pump. I just had like 1-2 psi coming of CO2 just to keep it fresh, and then put it up on the hand pump.
Cool. Thank you, Joe. More recent on the market is the Kegland Oxbar kegs, that are like giant pet. Well, they're giant versions of these, really. So some kind of like a pet bottle which has got an oxygen barrier layer in them. They are cheap. So you can get them in 4 litres and 8 litres. They're about I think £8 for the 4 litre and £10 for the 8 litre one. So yeah, they are. Let's see, I'll show you. There's one from one particular vendor. So it's basically sort of almost giant soft drinks bottles. And then from another place is the 4 litre one. So cheap and everything. When you add on, they also do a sort of little tapping head, which you can see here. Yeah, so if you want to add on actual tapping and stuff like that, I think the tapping head costs a little bit though. But what you can do is fill up the kegs, and then swap the tapping head onto it. When you run one keg out, you can swap it to another one, that sort of thing. So they are a cheaper option that's pretty good on the brewing scene now. Yeah, I haven't used them yet. Has anybody here used them?
I've got one, but I've not used it. Yeah, but if you want I think if you want the tapping heads, it's probably cheaper to go to AliExpress. I mean, the postage is crippling if you wanted to bring in the keg itself, but the tapping heads are relatively good, postage wise.
Okay.
Are those reusable? Because I think in the spec they don't describe them as reusable, but I'd have thought. Was there any reason you can't reuse them?
Yeah, they're reusable, Joel. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, so they're a new one. I mean, the thing with any keg, the big thing about them is kind of you need to be able to chill it somehow. So obviously, when the bigger volume it gets a bit more difficult. Pressure barrels are quite big. So you might need a dedicated fridge or just put them out in a cold space during the winter months. Not so good in the summer, but that's where the Ox bar and the mini kegs come in, and that you could actually stick them in a fridge more easily.
Speaking of pressure barrels, I've got a couple that I'm not using if anyone wants them. free of charge, but you'd have to collect them from Maidstone in Kent.
At the higher end, you've got the more expensive kegs. So the other things that are called mini kegs, I've got a picture of them up in the top right, the one from the malt miller. Again, you can buy them from various different places. You can get a tapping head from them that you can see on this picture. Stainless steel, tend to be 5 or 10 litres. And yeah, they have a small opening on the top of them. You can use them as a growler, so without any kind of tapping head, but then obviously you're pouring the beer straight out of them, so you need to drink that pretty quickly. Or you can have a setup like this, where you have a mini regulator with a little CO2 bulb. You can use a bigger regulator in a full-size CO2 tank. There's different ways of doing it. You put a tap on it directly, or have a dispense setup. I have 3 of these now, I think, 2 5 litres and a 10 litre that fill a little space in my kegerator, in between my bigger corny kegs. These are also really nice as a mobile option if you do want to go somewhere and serve your beer in 5 or 10 litres. Works really well for that sort of thing. Fairly expensive for the size though, so that's the only thing. Corny kegs, been around for a long time, sort of homebrew default keg, I think. They are generally about 19 litres in size. There's a couple of different formats of them you can get. There's sort of the tall kegs or the fat kegs, so you just need to check as to what you're going to get. You can get smaller ones. Normally they're 19 litres, which is 5 US gallons. You can get half that size, so it's sort of 9 litres, or you can get 12 litre ones occasionally, but they tend to be almost exactly the same cost as the big ones. Occasionally you'll find some of them cheap, but they're becoming rarer for secondhand, and yeah, so harder to find really cheap. But there's plenty of producers doing them not too expensively anymore. The good thing about them is they've got a great big opening in the top of them that you can get your arm into to help clean. Yeah, so that they are very sort of reusable, widely used. The negative with them for me is there's a lot of seals that need to be looked after, both in the disconnects, and also in the actual post that you put the disconnect onto. When you kind of plug a disconnect onto it and take one off, it self seals at both ends. So if you've got liquid either in the line or in the keg, it's not going to spurt out. That's the good side of it. But as a result, there's quite a lot of different sort of silicone and rubber seals in there that you need to keep an eye on, or you could end up with problems with. So they are occasionally prone to leaking if you don't look after them. But yeah, for me, they're sort of the ultimate homebrew keg. Above that, not many homebrewers have them. Are the sort of Sankey commercial kegs that come in generally are bigger sizes than the 19 litres. You do get some which are down that size, but yeah, these things are built for being distributed around to different pubs, being abused generally in the trade. They can take a lot of pressure, a lot of abuse, but they do need more of a commercial setup to manage. For one thing, they have essentially kind of a dip tube, the spear, which goes down into the middle of it, which needs a special tool to remove, because of for safety reasons. The spear is unlike the corny keg, where if you try and take the lid off, it won't come off until the keg's depressurized. A sort of commercial keg, if you try and undo the spear, and there's pressure in the keg, it will fire that spear straight up out at you. So you need to be careful with what you're doing. The other side of them is that they need a keg coupler, which again can be a bit more expensive. So these things are built for use in the trade, heavy repetitive use. So they're not, I think, so ideal for home brewing. The other problem for me with them is they've got quite a small opening on the top. you can't get your hand in there, so you really need a keg washer or get a pressure washer in there, or you stick a bunch of caustic in there and give it a good shake about. But yeah, it's more difficult to get into them, unlike the corny kegs, which whilst they're not designed originally for beer, they do work very well for it. Last slide I think I've got here. So just in terms of filling kegs up, the way I tend to do it is I will pre-purge them. So where I fill them up with sanitizer and then push that out with carbon dioxide. Normally I will do that using my CO2 cylinder, but you could also connect it up to an ongoing fermentation to push all that out and fill it with CO2. You could even just not connect it up to not fill it with sanitizer and just, if you probably push enough CO2 out through it from fermentation, that it will end up purging it. So I tend to do that just to make sure that the keg is completely flushed with CO2, and then it's a lot less susceptible to oxidation once you've filled it. Before filling, if you mentioned it, as I mentioned earlier on, add your gelatin or Browsol or whatever before filling it, because then you make sure that it's all nicely mixed in when you fill it. And then how you fill a keg, if you purged it and you fill it nice and quickly, you can get away with filling it straight in through the big lid. I have done. I have moved away from a fermenter that had a nice big tap on it, and I could essentially fill the keg in about a minute. It was rapid. And so what I would do is just run the hose straight down into the big sort of lid on the top, fill it up. Worked really well. But more recently, I've moved to filling it via the liquid port. So basically where I connect the fermenter onto this black disconnect here and just fill it up through that. The problem with that is you can't see how full the keg is. And that's where, as you can see here, I've got this keg on a set of scales, so I can actually see the weight of beer that's gone into it. Beer is same as water. It's not far off from water, and it's about sort of a kilo per litre. It's all close as. I mean, it's a bit different to that, but you don't really need to worry about it too much. So yeah, I tend to use the scales to sort of see how much it's filled. Yeah, that's about it really. That's how I go about filling my kegs without oxidation. I would have liked to have gone on and done a bit more about sort of bottling from kegs and things like that, but I've done that all before in another talk. So I didn't want to go too much on about kegs this evening. That's it. That's all I got. Any questions?
Great, thanks, James. That was excellent.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's awesome.
Very good.
Got a lot of ground there.
Question about the purging using an ongoing fermentation. That's something I'd never really thought about before. How much CO2 do you get out of that fermentation to go through that?
There was a
Someone's done the maths, I think.
Yeah,
Sorry,
there was a Brylosby video released just this week called "How to Be a Cheapskate Brewer," and I think they reckon you can purge about 60 litres from a single fermentation.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, there's someone on one of the things who's done the maths on it all and explains, you know, how much CO2 is produced per kilo of malt or whatever it is, and it's a lot of CO2. Yeah. So I mean, certainly for doing one, I'd let it go for a while, then put the keg in, and then, you know, leave that for a while, and you're pretty well. Yeah.
Yeah, I've done it for the last 4 or 5 batches, and yeah, generally after about day 2, the keg's empty.
Wow. Maybe needs to be doing this carbon capture thing.
My question there would be: Are you creating any back pressure on the fermentation, and if so, how much? And are you getting towards pressure fermenting, which has an effect on the type of beer you're fermenting, of course?
Well, I think, as pointed out, I think you don't need to purge the keg with sanitizer. if you leave it for long enough, someone's, I don't know, they've used a dissolved oxygen meter or something on product afterwards, and have found that, yeah, a keg left with a fermentation going through it, it's so much more that it will end up being pure CO2.
Yeah, and if you're pushing out sanitizer, that's quite a lot of pressure. That's like a meter maybe of liquid, of water that you need to push out.
I tend to do it. I leave it for a few days, then connect the keg up. So it's fermenting that at no pressure first of all, and then put the keg on it. Maybe 2 or 3 days into the fermentation, and it tends to. I find it can empty it in half a day, and then it's just like I've got a tube just going into a jerry can, which I collect the sanitizer back in. So it's just like a 20-litre blow off tube then.
And I'd say the only thing is, if you're like me and a little bit mean when I'm filling my fermenters, try and maximize. If you do get blow-offs, then either leave it until it's done its most vigorous fermentation, or stick a capture in between. I mean, you could just use a keg. You know, you could just use another keg or whatever, just in case you get any rubbish blowing off the top, because obviously you don't want that in your keg.
I was going to ask whether anybody uses Sankey kegs, but like with the normal corny keg fitting. So like I got off of Alibaba like one of these tri-clamp fittings for a Sankey keg that uses a normal gas in and liquid out. And I did for like a big party, I did a Sankey keg that way. Actually worked pretty well. But I did it was a bit dicey because just several of the variables were a bit different. And then I'll be honest, like 9 months later, I still haven't cleaned the keg out because I'm scared what's in there. You know, it's still under pressure, but like, I don't know, you know, it's like, I don't have means to wash it again properly.
The only person I think does is Richard Conroy, maybe. Not on this evening, but
I used to do them. I've still got 3 of them, but I haven't used them in years. Just because, yeah, it scares the crap out of me when it comes to purging it, emptying it. And yeah, I can never tell whether it's clean inside or not. I've got one of the bucket blasters to blow up inside it, but it's like, I don't know if that's clean.
yeah, definitely requires industrial strength chemicals and keg washer.
But, and it's an expensive mistake if it doesn't work, because it's like, what, 50 liters, 45 liters, something like that down the drain.
I've got the little 20-litre ones, so yeah, but still.
Cool.
On your point on seals, James, some of the first batches of cornies I bought, I think I bought 2 batches of 3 a piece. And there were these like 3 tall ones that had been cleaned out, grade, I don't know, grade B, grade A, whatever. And then I went on to buy another half dozen of the AB fat ones. And almost all of my leak issues are, without question, all of my grade B tall skinny ones that have been beaten up, knocked about. They are like one of my, I won't say big, it's hardly a biggest regret, is it? Jesus, first world problems. But you know, it's definitely, if I could go back in time, I would never have bothered saving the money on buying 3 for 90 quid. I'd have just gone and bought the AB ones because they're bulletproof.
That's interesting, because I've got, well, having changed the seals on a bunch of them, I mean, the first kegs I got were bought off of, I think, an ex-member, the club now, well, he was a pro brewer and I think now a distiller. You can work out who it is from that. sold off his corny kegs, and I bought them. And aside from one which had it was an American one that had a weird thread on it and a missing post that basically was going to cost basically it was going to cost a new keg to get the post across from the US. They were all solid despite being beaten up. I've got various ones that like Britvic, Cornelius, really heavily beaten up and everything. They're all been fine. You just have to keep an eye on the various seals on them and like and replace them. They're not expensive, it's very cheap. It's just keeping an eye on them. The only time I've had an issue was actually with a disconnect, where I bought a nice stainless steel what do you call it, flow control disconnect, and I've got them on all of my kegs now because they work really well, but I had used one which had obviously been pre-assembled, and I hadn't checked that it had all the seals in it, and there was a seal missing. I hooked up the keg, had a pint from it, came back to it next day, and oh, the rest of my keg is in the bottom of my Keyser. There's a swimming pool of beer down there. So I've learned, first of all, if I'm leaving the gas on when I'm carbonating, then take the liquid disconnect off. But also then I just don't leave the gas on the rest of the time once it's carbonated, and I keep an eye out for things like that once I first put a keg on, because there's lots of seals that can leak, so you just occasionally want to take the whole keg apart every now and then and check, or just replace the seals out of habit.
Yeah, no, the only other thing I've noticed on those is be careful of dinging the actual where the opening is, where the lid is, because, and again, buying second hands, just if you are, just make sure that it's a reasonably good smooth opening and hasn't been dinged, because I've had a couple that have leaked on me through just having a dent where the big rubber O-ring goes.
The only other thing I had was where the feet of the handle were worn out basically from so much use, and it meant that the keg, the handle didn't push down hard enough anymore. And I replaced the feet, and in the end it was just, I just bought a new lid. They're like 15 quid and much stronger seal on them from buying a new lid like that. So yeah,
I had the same thing. I started putting pound coins under the little feet, but it's like,
I bought some new feet,
just
and
buy
it's like,
another
well,
lid.
these don't stick on properly, and then I glued them on. And I was like, oh, in the end, just bollocks, and just chuck the lid and buy a new one for 15 quid.
Exactly. Actually, I had the same issue with you as you, Ian. Only the tall ones, and I are they older or less?
Where are they leaking from?
Well, I think
the posts I had exact same issue with as Ian, the flat the little fat AEB ones, all fine, but the taller ones, they seem to be older, maybe, but they're the only ones I've had issues with. The only pro with those ones is you can get to the post a little bit easier because there's a nice gap. Have a little gap.
I find with
I
the
just lost a bottle of gas to one of the tall ones.
Oh, never leave it on. Never ever.
Done that twice.
I find with my AEB ones, we got some in, but like the way the lid seals is so tight. You know, literally the distance between the proud part of the lid and my other ones, the tall ones, I mean, it's literally flapping about in there, and I can see chunks of the silicon seal underneath. Most of the parts wear around, like it's all over the shop. So
I'm the same.
But I'm trying to remember. I have tried some of those new lids. I'm probably not there yet, but yeah, they're a good option. And I think on Ali they're about a tenner as well. So
so what's the difference between the tall, skinny ones and the AEB fat ones? Are they newer? Is one newer or older? Or...
AEB,
some of them have got dates on them, I've noticed.
Yeah, AEB is still being produced in Italy.
Okay.
So you can you can still buy them new. And I think the tall, skinny ones are the old original. Who are they made? Well, the old one, the original Cornelius and Britvic and
Firestone, and I think there's Firestone make one as well. Well, I've got one that's branded Firestone.
Yep, that's the Firestone one. Was the one that had the weird post thread on it that I ended up just chucking because it's just
Well, I changed most of the posts on the Cornelius, well, the tall ones anyway, because I got some of those cheap universal posts from AliExpress, and I just thought rather than having lots of different spanners, because they do vary on the way that they're tightened up and so on.
I had the same issue as you, Jerome, with the opening on the tall ones. It's really dented for some reason, so you have to. So the only way I've worked it is to almost hold the thing up by the lid handle and get it to kind of sit well, and then clamp the lid down and then give it 20-30 psi to make sure the stupid thing seals properly. Otherwise it leaks and you have flat beer. But
I mean, I don't know whether it's because the Cornelius ones, the lids are different, aren't they? Instead of having their feet splayed, I don't know, they're certainly not universal either. You can't use I don't think you can use an AEB one on a Cornelius because the feet it's where the posts are or something. I find that there are some of the taller ones, the lids aren't, I don't know which way it is, but they're not necessarily fit both ones.
I'm going to call it an evening, guys. I'll see you all in person or on here next month. So.
Thanks, James.
Cheers, James. Very good. Excellent work.
Bye.
See you later. Bye.
I think it depends on the make of the kegs, because all of mine are the tall ones, but they're Kegland and they're all more modern. So I don't have any issues with those. In fact, the only issue I have had with them is with nitro. I was at 40 odd PSI. I pulled off the beer disconnect a bit too quickly when I was cleaning my beer lines. And because of the pressure inside the keg, the rubber seal around the poppet came out through the hole. So I no longer had a seal on the beer outpost, and I had 40 PSI inside the keg. And that sprayed as well.
You put your finger on it.
Well, I pulled the pressure release valve pretty quickly just to depressurize the keg quickly. But that's the only issue I've had with them, actually. They've been pretty good otherwise.
How often do you have to redecorate the inside of your brew shed?
Well, increasingly often.
At least all the stripping's done. You know, there's no sugar soaping to be done. It's all gone. Mate.
No. Well, the caustic took off the beer.
Yeah.
And the varnish.
What are you
there's
doing?
all kinds of strange things going on my
sorry,
screen.
Can everyone else see that? I was just.
What are you drawing, Rob?
Showing it.
Rob's jumping about all over the screen.
I hope you're not browsing something risque.
Sorry.
That's looking very strange. Have we been hacked?
Sorry.
Or at least if you are, it'd be good enough to share it.
There's new things since I last logged on, and I was like, "Oh, what does that do?"
And you press the red button.